The Deep End team acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands on which we work and live, pays respect to elders past, present and future, and recognises the importance of Indigenous knowledge to informing public debate. Our guest on this episode of The Deep End is Peter Yu. Peter Yu is a Yawuru man from Broome in the Kimberley region of northwest Australia with more than 40 years' experience in Indigenous development and advocacy at the state, national and international levels. He is a professor at the Australian National University, where he is also the inaugural Vice President, First Nations. He has been instrumental in developing many influential community organisations and initiatives in the Kimberley region. He has previously worked as Executive Director of the Kimberley Land Council and was a member of the national leadership team who negotiated the Australian Government's response to the 1992 Mabo High Court judgement. He was a key negotiator on behalf of Yawuru Native Title Holders with the Western Australian Government and was recently Chief Executive Officer of the Yawuru Corporate Group.
Today in our podcast, The Deep End, Aaron and I are speaking to Professor Peter Yu, AM. He's a Yawuru man from Broome in the Kimberley region in northwest Australia with over 40 years' experience in Indigenous development and advocacy in the Kimberley and at the state, national and international levels. He is the current inaugural Vice President, First Nations portfolio at the Australian National University. He holds many other roles as well, and one of great importance at the moment is that his membership of the referendum working group on Indigenous constitutional recognition and the voice leading up to the referendum. So, Peter, tell us a little bit about being a Yawuru leader. You say on your website you're a Yawuru man. I would say that you're a Yawuru leader. And how you have basically built a nation through your work as the key negotiator on behalf of the Yawuru Native Title Holders with the Western Australian Government.
I think, Marcia, thanks very much for having me, but I think it probably goes back a long time in terms of what I would call my apprenticeship years back in the Kimberleys, with my career having worked with the WA Museum way back in the 70s under the 1972 Aboriginal Heritage Act as a trainee site recorder. In fact, that was the title. So part of that role was working with the Aboriginal Sites Department back in my own home turf in the Kimberleys with senior cultural leaders, recording public sites throughout the Kimberleys, and post that, I guess, working in various different roles with after that, I worked very briefly as a welfare aide for the Department for Community Welfare. Everybody was an aide them days, welfare aide, health aides, teachers' aides, police aides, and so I agitated on the basis of a promotion on the basis that it was an industrial question, and my intimate knowledge of my own community was far greater than that of the kind of graduate welfare officers they were setting up from Perth after 2 years for 2-year stints and providing some level of continuity. And they got sick of me asking, and then said, if you wanted to get promotion, do you want to go to Wyndham? And everybody used to refer the department as the Cambridge Gulf as the arsehole of the earth, and Wyndham was 40 miles up it, and nobody wanted to go there. So I said I'd go there, and then I worked very closely with the Umbalgari community, and who were then residing on the local reserve in Wyndham, and my job was to get them back on their traditional turf up the Forest River. And then leaving that and then joining the Land Council as a first field officer. At that time, with the emergence of the early days of the Kimberley Land Council, I was the first field officer and spent quite a bit of time during the Nookanbar dispute and also the what was happening at Argyle with the Gidja people at Wom. So I had a fairly in-depth, I would say, apprenticeship after leaving school, working in with very senior people that I still respect today. So I guess if it wasn't for them, I probably wouldn't have had the opportunity to do what I've done in my career. But was also very conscious of my own Yawuru-ness, for want of a better word, because we lived in very much in that what I call the apartheid kind of era, where, like many Aboriginal people, my grandmother was part of Stolen Generation. My mother was taken off when she was born in the Catholic mission in Beagle Bay, put into the dormitory. My father was Chinese. He was a pearl diver, so both my father was living under threat of deportation because he was a foreign national as an indentured labourer as a pearl diver, and my mother was under constant threat of deportation back to the Beagle Bay mission because it was against the law to cohabit with the native under the Native Welfare Act. So I guess I saw that, but even though I had a fantastic childhood growing up in Broome, as you would, being on the coast, and most of my time was actually spent fishing and hunting. In those days, of course, we didn't have supermarkets, so we had to go fishing. My grandfather and my uncles took me fishing and hunting every day, and so I was very conscious, and being around Yawuru people all the time. Even though we weren't allowed, like Aboriginal kids all around Australia, weren't allowed to speak our language in school. We were discouraged from speaking it, but we were always around that after school. So I guess we were very proud people. I think because even though we had this form of apartheid. And we understood the nature. Well, we didn't understand it. We were kids. We knew something was wrong, but we had the very good parents. Even though things weren't good for them necessarily, but they looked after us. They did the best. We, like a lot of people, we didn't have any money, so that's why we had to go fishing and hunting to sustain our lifestyle. So I always knew that for me, the presence growing up in my own country, the confidence of having my family around, but also at the same time being challenged by knowing that we were living in this environment that was structured by the nature of the kind of racist legislations and the kind of prejudices that you encountered on a daily basis. I think one of the lucky things, of course, going to school, we were educated by the Irish Catholic nuns, St. John of God's, where we were basically all Aboriginal kids. And so, I recall there was probably one or two white kids in the class. Sorry, it's a long story, but that's just a bit of background, I guess, in terms of where you understand where you're coming from. But we, of course, spent 14 years in the federal court from 1994 in respect to our native title claim following the enactment of the Native Title Act. Was one of the most challenging kind of I guess things we had to go through in terms of the cross-examination of watching my families, all my uncles and my aunties being challenged about their personal lives. One of my aunties has about, 9 or 10, 11 kids, probably from 2 or 3 different fathers, and being interrogated to the extent that the state to try and prove the nature of our disconnection, so to speak, on the basis of having different fathers and not being connected to the country, I think, would be anything worse than you'd ever get in terms of the intrusion into somebody's private life.
Yeah.
But we, we came through that. Many people thought that we wouldn't have a chance because we were, even though we live in the north, it's probably a rural town, so to speak, popular for tourists. People thought we'd lost our language, we'd lost our connection to our country, our knowledge systems, our connection to kin, our understanding about our ceremonies. It was all an assumption. But we, of course, won hands down in relation to that determination. So that we, as a consequence of that, became the largest private landowner in Broome. So I think, but having had the broader experience, I suppose, as a Yarra person outside of Broome, I think going outside and travelling, around the country, having been overseas several times, open your eyes up to a lot more of the reality of the circumstances that go beyond your very narrow perspective, being brought up in a very small town and meeting a lot of people and engaging with people in a professional sense and understanding others' histories, but the commonality of shared history with other Aboriginal people and learning off their experiences is something that stick by. But I think I was an NAC member from 1981 to 85.
That was the National Aboriginal Conference?
Yeah, that was the National Aboriginal Conference. I was asked to run after I finished as with the Kimberley Land Council. All the senior men and women asked, I suppose because I could probably speak a little bit better English than most, as English was probably a second or third language for most people. But because people thought I'd had an education, I only went to year 11. I didn't go to finish high school or university or TAFE or anything like that. So I think people trust, they put their trust in me, and something I've always been obviously eternally quite grateful for. So I ran for the NAC until that was done away and represented the West Kimberley. I think I was the youngest member elected that year in 1981. There are a lot more senior men who were running for this NAC as well, but because I had the support of most of the people from the bush areas, having worked with them fairly closely before that, when I worked for welfare and then for the Land Council, I think was able to gain their confidence. Yeah, so that was, and then I guess that all came in handy in some ways because you're thrown into the deep end and you got to learn, as they say, you learn to swim or drown. So in most cases, I've been thrown in the deep end. I've had my senior mentors have been senior Aboriginal women that I worked with before in Kimberley. I grew up in a period, I suppose, where post the 68 partial award wages, when we had an internal refugee situation, I think, which is what we're currently confronted with now, notwithstanding the harsh conditions prior to that, but when people were kicked off cattle stations and gates were locked and congregated around the kind of, pastoral towns of Fitzroy, Halls Creek, Derby, Broome, Wyndham, it was like an internal refugee situation happening overnight. No infrastructure, no services, no programs, no support. People being seriously challenged, and of course that was the genesis of the Homelands Denunciation movement. So one of my jobs was actually initially working with people in town, and a lot of those people were women because I think the men were seriously challenged. Their kind of cultural authority, they're being off country, nothing much to do around town. That's when people got in, the alcohol and the grog and the kind of domestic violence and all that kind of rubbish stuff happened. But the women were very strong, and they had. I remember they had the homemaker service. They're the ones who really kept people together until we started the kind of moving back onto country and, being confronted with the locked gates. So, we used to go with bolt cutters and cut the gates and just take people back and help set them up. But in doing so, of course, you run into all the exploration companies back onto the country. And so in some cases, we were able to negotiate and get things like bores put down to get water for the community, or could get the roads put in so we can get out bush to back people setting up their own art stations. So that was kind of like in the 70s, help setting up that. So I suppose there's a broad range of different kind of levels, coming out of that. I mean, got exposed to government, didn't know anything really about government, but how they operate, how they make their kind of programs, how the system works between the Commonwealth and the state, and how challenging it was in terms of the sense of the mistrust, but the dependency that people still had on government because people had nothing. But I think I think in the Kimberleys, the art station movement harnessed the kind of political energies and focus of communities in dealing with governments. And as you know, we had the Nukunba dispute and Argyle Darwin mine. My job was to basically set up the communication network. I travelled the Kimberleys for like 12 months with 4 of some of the most senior cultural figures that were around at that time, linking up communities in support of the Nukunba Yawuru community at Nukunba. I think that's where I might have met you first time, Marcia, up there.
That's right. I was working for the first chairman of the Kimberley Land Council as a volunteer.
Yeah.
I volunteered. Yeah.
Yeah. So we had a lot of good support for people like yourself coming up there, and but my job was to basically just go from community to community, like for 12 months, just travel with. And also to try and help people at the at Turkey Creek and Runkununurra in relation to the it was CRA at that stage who were exploring around Argyle. The community didn't really know much about what was happening there. One day I got a note from Frankie Chulong, who was the legal service ALS field officer there. He sent me a telegram saying that I was working out of Derby off it, and sent me a telegram saying that the Rio Tinto had been picking up all the TOs from around Warman and other places and taking them to the exploration site on Argyle. And I sent a telegram back saying to them, don't sign anything until they've got independent legal advice. And then they flew down in their Learjet. They flew 5 of the TOs down to Perth that night and they went around to Graham McDonald, I think, who was the community's lawyer, to try and give him instructions in terms of those negotiations. And he refused to take instructions, so they went around the corner and got another lawyer. And they signed that good neighbour agreement. It was structured in a way that there wasn't any royalties or any cash payments, and it was only in kind, because his father, Charlie Court, was a premier at that stage, and acknowledgement of provision of any royalties would have acknowledged the people's interest in the land, and of course, so he did everything to avoid that. So there was that. I was also working with the Yawuru community out of Ringasoke. You might remember they were in town for the local races in Halls Creek, and they were one of the really few people still connected very much to their country, and their dogs in their houses, or they're not really houses, but they're tin sheds got shot up by, I think Giles Loader was a bloke who was the owner of Gordon Downs, and then they had another bloke working for him, and they shot everything up, and so they're trying to intimidate the people from not going back to their community. So I lived with the Yawuru community at Yawuru Creek and Halls Creek for a few months, helping to get them back on their feet and finally negotiated an excision on Gordon Downs, which is now, of course, Ring of Soak. Work with one of the most the strongest leaders. I think I can say his name if they wouldn't mind. Old Mick Rala. Everybody knows him. He was legendary. Ran his community with a very strong hand, very much committed to the kind of the ways of his law and his culture, and the strength of that was quite an incredible thing to witness. The nature of the way he tried to protect his community from the kind of the influences of being in town and stuff. But yeah, it had a serious impact on that community.
It was almost like they were still waging the frontier wars.
Well, it was. I mean, there were people like old Lightning, who was knocked off his horse as a stockman by doing aerial muster and deliberately flying low to stir up the cattle and the stockman there, and he fell off his horse and had a very bad injured leg, and wasn't able to get any kind of workers' compensation for it. There was an old lady who lived out there. I remember her when I saw her. You might recall, she was on her knees. She had some, I'm not sure what her particular disability or illness was, but she could only get around by having these knee pads on and walking around on her knees. And there was only one tap. While the homestead had all these sprinklers going most of the day, the community only had one tap, which is about 100 or so meters towards the homestead, where they could walk to get water. And I remember this old girl walking on her knees to get water. It was a very wild time. I mean, in quite a dangerous time, and people were very intimidated. I mean, there were guns and there were other things around, and people weren't afraid to kind of show them quite openly.
Well, I remember those cattle station owners. They were still flogging people with whips and horse hobbles.
Yeah, I mean, there are numerous stories about that. I mean, a lot of my work in that time during the KLC and afterwards, before we'd welfare and even afterwards. When I was in Wyndham, I actually had a situation at Four Creek, which was a pensioner community just out of town, about 20 k's out of town. And I think the Anglican Church had set it up. And there was a number of these old kind of cast iron huts and a shed in the middle of it. And when I first arrived there in 1978, there would have probably been about 10 or 15 people living there. My first experience was seeing this old girl lying on one of those cast iron beds, just a blanket on it, and basically her body and the walls were covered with ticks. And the walls were like carpet. The ticks were like carpet on the wall, and it was just a horrific. My first time I'd seen anything like that. But I had to actually get a couple of ladies from the hospital, had to carry her out of there, and had asked them to help me to clean her and get her out. But there was an old guy living. His name was Ernest, and he lived a little bit further from the rest of the crew. And I was always intrigued by that. And I did ask, I said, why is Ernest living there? And Ernest had about 15 or 20 dogs around him, because, these were frail old people back in 1978. And they said, oh, that's the police boy. They said, that's the police boy. That's the one that took them up to Umbulgari, Forest River Mission, in 27, when they had the massacre up there. So this here was a living example of old Ernest. Poor old bloke. I felt sorry for him a bit. I got to know him and had a chat to him, because I had to start a kind of dog washing clinic every fortnight, where I got a couple of these 44-gallon drums cut with some oxy, and I used to put them in strategic places, and then I'd come out. I'd ask the old blokes to fill it up with water, and I'd come out with the suntol, the dog wash, so that they could then wash the dogs. But the dogs were they were like life partners to these old people. They actually went out hunting sometimes for themselves, but they also used to hunt, and the old people used to get some of that food off the dogs after they brought it back. It was quite incredible kind of scenes. And but after a while, I started a program with those old people. I got them to chuck in $10 from their pension, and we went down to Dundun Station every fortnight, and I would we'd get a killer, we'd shoot a beast, cut it up, I'd put it in my fridge, and I'd got a couple of the local TO domestics from the hospital under some health program to come and cook every day. I used the money from working in welfare to build a shed and build a kitchen and build a storage place for their food. And we built a little market garden, because a lot of those old people used to work in the stations and grow their vegetables and stuff. They knew how to grow vegetables. And so they really loved that. I just bought the kind of fancy wire and the posts, and I put up this little yard and got water and sprinkler system going, and they grew fantastic veggies during the dry months up there. And that was part of, I guess, working in community development, getting people to do things for themselves. They were aged, but they were very knowledgeable. It was one of the most enjoyable jobs that I had, actually, working with those old people, until, of course, then young people found out what was going on in town, and these were the people who were getting pissed at the pub and then looking for food after the pub had closed, and then getting bloody taxi drivers to drive them out to the community, and then threatening the old people to try and get their food. It was extremely challenging for me in that sort of situation, because in Wyndham that time, they couldn't believe that the white fellas couldn't believe I was in charge, and the black fellas couldn't believe that I was in charge of office. I was the youngest welfare officer, district officer, they called it then. So the white fellas used to go above my head and go back to my supervisor in Derby. He was an Irishman, social worker called Michael O'Kane. And fortunately, he backed me. So every time they used to go, where the prison, the health, the police, they wouldn't want to deal with me because I was Aboriginal. And the Aboriginal people didn't want to deal with me because they couldn't believe that I was in charge of the office. So I was copying it both ways. Till I, one day when all the football stars were away, and I played a game of footy with the blokes from DAA and for the local town side, and I won the game for them. I kicked 2 goals. Playing in the centre, I won the game for them, and all of a sudden everybody loved me.
That's the magic.
Sporting diplomacy. Yeah.
I remember those days. I remember, going into camps like the Christmas Creek camp, and people were basically starving, and they didn't even have a killer, a beast. They had the head of a beast, and they were the head had to be shared out with at least 30 people from memory. And I think about those days, and I wonder how far we've come. I mean, I think the malnutrition and lack of food I'm seeing in communities now is, it's different to those times, but at the same time, people are going hungry every second week in Aboriginal communities, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. Without a doubt. I mean, it's people just can't afford to buy food in those communities. There's probably been an improvement in the supply chain, but probably not all that much, because I don't know. I haven't been out, I must be honest, I haven't been out to some of those communities for quite a number of years, but I think I can't see it have changed all that dramatically. I mean, some of the actual stores might have improved their stock, but I don't know if people can afford it or not. I mean, how are you paying, upwards of $10 and more for a lettuce or a piece of fresh fruit or bread or things like that? So people, I think, are largely still on basic diet, which would be damper and tea, and I think people would be probably, I don't know how much people are actually going out hunting these days as well, because you're in competition with a whole range of other activities other than seen to be interfering in relation to running stations or whatever else is happening. But it clearly points towards not only the availability of good food, but it's the kind of adequacy of the diet that people are having. We know the consequences of diabetes. I mean, we lose too many people too prematurely.
Yeah.
Because our families, we're all. I mean, I just found out the other day, that I'm a diabetic after trying to fight it off for many years. My mother was a diabetic for 50 years. She didn't drink or smoke, but it eventually caused her organs to fail. Yeah, I mean, it's still inadequate. There's no two ways about it.
And we hear people saying from the No campaign, the people who are arguing against the referendum question, the proposal for constitutional recognition through the voice, that colonisation was good for us. Now we've got running water and sustainable food, or access to food, and you and I know that that's absolutely not the case. Not only is the water not drinkable in these communities, we have serious food security issues right across most of remote Australia.
And we have poverty. We have people running out of money for food on day 8 of the pay cycle.
Yeah.
Well, I know everybody says we've got everything, but I don't know why would you want to be a blackfellow today with everything that we're supposed to have. So, yes, I guess the colonisation has been extremely generous to us in that respect. But, well, it's an untruth, obviously. It's very much I have absolutely no appreciation of the logic other than there's a deliberate wanting to distort the facts for political gain and reasoning, wanting to deprive people of real opportunity, wanting to pursue the nature of a just and reasonable coexistence relationship. I do not understand the logic. The voice is probably the simplest of the simplest propositions they could ever even imagine. So the logic escapes me, other than there is some ulterior kind of ideological position here that's driving. It's particularly disappointing to have Aboriginal people espousing and propagating this kind of nonsense. And I think it's an issue of a greater sense of accountability. It's interesting, in reference to Jacinta Price. I think she was her parents. I don't know if you remember, but it was about 1980. They were on their way to teach at Nookanbar Station. In fact,
I remember.
And I was the one who actually pulled them across Ngumban Creek. There was a flooded creek. They couldn't get across, and I was working for the Land Council, and I pulled them across so they could get across the other side and on their way to Fitzroy Crossing. I don't know them well at all. I think them a couple of times afterwards when they visited Broome, but I think she was probably that baby. She was only a baby at that stage. I don't know what's happened to her since then. Yeah, it's not a matter for me. I guess it's a matter for our own community. I mean, I think this is where the issue is. I mean, I think Ned Hargraves kind of quite rightly pointed out in his comments about her unrepresentation of the views of people from her own community.
Yeah, so he's made a number of very clear statements as I think one of the most important elders in Yuendamu, to the effect that she does not represent Warlpiri people. She has no standing in Warlpiri culture. He's also said that. And moreover, the Central Land Council published their resolution saying that she does not represent all of their people and communities. So it's quite a problem. Now, I want to put this question to you. You talked about the Yawuru Native Title claim and how very long your people fought for that. And as a result, you now have the Yawuru Native Title Corporation, which I've seen every now and again. It seems to me to be one of the most successful native title corporations. It's quite a large governance and entrepreneurial entity in the region. And I'd love it if you'd talk a bit about that. But I heard Warren Mundine say that the Voice will become like a dictatorial authority over native title holders. Now, you're on the referendum working group. You've played a role in all of these developments. What do you think of what he's saying that, in relation to native title corporations like yours?
Well, I'd say I don't know what he's talking about, because I don't know that he necessarily understands the nature and the nuances of what the roles and functions of PBCs are. Of course, PBCs are, following the determination, they are the legal entities under the kind of legislation, statutory organisations that are holding the common law native title in trust for the common law native title holders. I think it's just really couldn't be anything further from the truth. I mean, in our corporation, we very clearly understood that there was a demarcation between the nature of ensuring that we had clear responsibility in the cultural and customary imperatives that drove us and drives us continually and has to sustaining our culture, our language, our connection, our families, and the nature of what we believe in as Yawuru people from, not from a philosophical but also a practical point of view, and how that's a lived experience on a daily basis. But I guess a lot of that has come about, Senator Dodson, Pat was the chair, and I was the original CEO, given the fact that we've had a wider exposure and experience in many different kind of roles and positions, helped to understand that. The fact that there needed to be an ability to reinvigorate the kind of the sense of focus on who we are as a Yawuru nation, and what we needed to do to be able to bring people back who may have been disconnected over a very long period of time, because like everybody else, everything's not pure. Many of our families all come from stolen generation. We come from a kind of mission Catholic upbringing. We're challenged by the kind of intra-disputation and jealousies, and like everybody else. But one thing that we did have was clear philosophical underpinnings in relation to who we are and what we stood for, and that was critically the question of Mabo, three things: Mabo Lian, which is about the well-being of the individual; Mabo Buru is the well-being of the country; and Mabo Ngoranganil, which is the well-being of the community. That's the community, self, and country. And understanding the nature of what the Bugaragara is. Most people in the broader world would talk about creator beings, but where we come from, where we are born, and basically what our senses as Aboriginal people are, what our Lian tells us about how we are and how we should behave and how we should interact and how we should pay due respect and acknowledgement for the things that we've inherited. I think that we were very strong on that. That was the kind of underpinning philosophy, and providing a kind of translating that, interpreting that into a governance framework was critically important. But I think also a very practical exercise was we did a kind of longitudinal data research project in identifying who we were and what our circumstances were in Broome. When we first started, we had John Taylor, who you would know, set up a research project, and we had our own people as the data researchers going out to every household, just so we could, I suppose, define more clearly and categorically who was Yawuru in 2010, and where do we, what are the challenges we face, what are our aspirations, what are the challenges, whether it be for housing, employment. So we were able to establish a profile, and we were able to use that as the basis upon which we developed our kind of aspirational ideas into some priorities. And critically was the housing area. Housing was critical, like everywhere else. Not enough housing, very poor housing, overcrowding in housing. So we targeted that as a critical part of engaging our community. While simultaneously, I set up the language centre. At that stage, we only probably had 4 to 6 fluent speakers of Yawuru left, whereas today now we're teaching Yawuru to about 1,500 school kids in primary school in Broome, and we've have about a dozen or so more fluent language teachers where we didn't have when we first started. So it was juxtaposing the nature of the economic opportunities that came, but having the right structure, right governance structure, right framework, but also understanding the kind of imperatives that of rebuilding the nation in regards to our language, our culture. We started dance programs, learning people dancing to song. We opened up a ceremonial ground that we hadn't used for about 30 years. We had about thousands people. We had all of our where the law runs, all the way down from Exmouth, Onslow, Port Hedland, all the way through, people coming up and celebrating with us. It was one of the most joyful occasions I've witnessed in this kind of Renaissance period. And that has built very strong kind of belief and aspiration and commitment in our younger people coming through to see this happening. It's quite phenomenal, actually. What Mundine talks about, I don't know what he's talking about, because I think he certainly ain't talking through with any sense of logic or intelligence in respect to this relationship.
So I'm glad you cleared that up. Well, what's your view on the voice? Will the voice help us to, say, for instance, help you and your people to continue the work of building the Yawuru Nation and closing the gap?
I think the fundamental value of the voice, which is not going to be a silver bullet or a panacea for everything, this is going to take time. But I want to just make a quick comment about ATSIC, because everybody comes down on ATSIC, and certainly there were major problems and issues at the national level. But I got to say that at the regional level, at the local level, there were some parts of ATSIC were starting to work. People felt engaged and were represented, and things were starting to happen between local government and also state governments. I think even if it wasn't happening at the national level, I think that's part of the truth. I think the value of the voice is that it will bring a greater transparency and capability in terms of getting a greater return of the current investments being provided for dealing with our continued marginalisation and disadvantage, and to deal with all of the closing the gap things that embarrassingly where the Prime Minister gets up every year and says that we aren't closing anything and closing the gap. I think that I've said publicly before that it's roughly about 30 cents on the dollar, if that actually hits the ground on projects after being distributed through the kind of very convoluted federated system that ends up via Perth or Adelaide or Melbourne or Darwin or Kununurra, Broome, Cairns. We have this ongoing colonial codependency shackles that are on us. We've got to unshackle that. We've got to cut the chains. We've got to start owning that risk ourselves. That's the mantra that we need to have, owning our own risk, and the voice presents that the real opportunity to do that.
So we're coming to an end, and look, this has all been exceedingly fascinating and very valuable, and it'd be great to talk to you again in future episodes, which will continue after the referendum. It'd be lovely to have you back to explore some of those themes more deeply and all the things that are happening today in terms of, reclamation. But for people who are facing the referendum and the important decision we have to make on the 14th of October. To people who are genuinely undecided, what would you say to them moving forward today?
I would say that the voice is the simplest of simple propositions. It offers no threat. It offers only an opportunity to work in a collaborative effort to ensure that the level of investment that people are making, from a purely pragmatic point of view, if you were a private company or a family company and you were operating in the space the government is working with Aboriginal people, you wouldn't even start a business because you'd never be successful. And so what we're trying to do is to say the value of your contribution and your aspirations to see a much more balanced and reconciled country. The voice presents the best opportunity that I've seen in my lifetime, my 40 years that I've been on this planet. And it is not a threat. In fact, it will deliver you and it will deliver the country a better return for the enormous amount of money that's spent on trying to do things that it hasn't been yet able to achieve. And I think what it will do is allow us to engage more locally in storytelling is very important, because I think what we need to have here is a national oral history project. Yeah. I think what this has demonstrated is we need to have a national oral history project. If the government can spend $500 million on the War Memorial, it can spend $500 million on ordinary Australians in their own communities sitting down and talking about the realities of their experiences. I think that that would be a very beneficial exercise post the referendum as part of the Makarrata Truth-Telling Commission. But I would say there's nothing to be afraid of. I do not see, if you don't understand, obviously find out, but I think that what we'll demonstrate is this is fair and reasonable, and we're building the incremental steps towards the nature of what I think most Australians really want to see happen, and that's an improved circumstances in the kind of lifestyle and the health and well-being of Aboriginal people.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. That was a wonderful exposition of many of your achievements in life and the extraordinary town and region that you come from, your people, and your experience. So we'll come back to you for another podcast after the referendum, if that's okay.
That's fine, Marcia. I hope that's been helpful. There's so much to talk about, but it's, obviously you're never going to get enough time to do that.
Yeah.
Well, fortunately, we have a series. In fact, let's start where you left off when you come back and talk about what needs to be done next. That's a great idea about a national project for oral histories.
Yeah.
And let's get as many good ideas out there as possible. Maybe somebody will listen.
Well, I think that in ending, I think basically we have to somehow reinvigorate the kind of the question of this notion of collective leadership. We need to make sure that when the voice gets up, we need to have a very clear understanding of the manifesto or the charter or whatever you call it is, that is very explicit about the nature of the commitment and the kind of responsibility the voice has to our own people in the first instance. I think to make it very clear about that, I think it's very important.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Thank you so much for your time.
All right, thanks Marcia.
Thanks, Peter. Go well.